your personal brand walks ahead of you into that space. So even if you're walking into a room with people, a virtual room with people that you've never met, your brand precedes you. And so how do people perceive you? And is it aligned with how you want to be perceived? When you view yourself as a change agent, you're forced to pause, you're forced to ask better questions. You become an advocate for what real change actually requires.
Meet Lucy. She stares at the PDF on her screen. She changes the heading, changes it back. Then she plays a voice memo from her chief programming officer.
Hey, Lucy, can you just put together something quick for managers? Nothing fancy, maybe a PDF. If we can get that out today, that'd be great.
Lucy leans back in her chair.
They're not going to even use this.
She already knows the pattern. Something goes wrong. Leadership panics. They ask for training. Lucy builds something. She sends it out to everyone. Few skim it, but most people ignore it. And everyone moves on. She's been with this nonprofit now for over 18 months. And she really believes in the mission. And that's why she gets so frustrated. She doesn't want to just make another PDF. She wants to ask deeper questions. Why are managers struggling in the first place? What behavior needs to change? What would actually help them perform differently 6 months from now? A reminder hits her calendar for a leadership meeting she has in 5 minutes. Lucy exhales. Then she reads a text from her fiancé.
Dinner at 7 tonight?
She smiles for half a second. Then another Slack message appears.
Lucy, any update on that PDF?
Her smile disappears. Lucy doesn't want to be just an order taker. She wants a seat at the table before the problem happens. Today, I'm speaking with Heather Burright, nonprofit L&D consultant, speaker, and podcast host. Heather helps nonprofits move beyond reactionary training and into learning that actually changes behavior and drives performance. And I'm excited to hear how Heather would help someone like Lucy to stop taking orders and start creating lasting change. My name is Jay Abbasi, and welcome to Unstuck. Real people, real stories, real solutions. While the details are changed to protect anonymity, what you just heard is based on a true story of challenges that come up in the real world. And we discuss how to navigate these environments with practical tips to help you get unstuck and build a more fulfilling, impactful, and balanced life and career. So Heather, in learning about you, you're in learning and development, and I have a background in learning and development as well. And I know there's always a story as to why someone gets into learning and development. There's always a story. Something happened that got you really passionate about this work. Tell me, what's that story?
Yeah, it's funny. I occasionally, but rarely bump into people who went to school thinking this is what they were going to do with their life. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up, to be honest with you. I changed my major 4 or 5 times in college trying to figure it out, and landed on an English degree because it was so open-ended. I could do anything, right? And then I graduated and was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So I got a job in a curriculum department that trained first responders. So we were creating the training, writing the training for first responders. And I was in the editing team. And the training had been historically kind of first responder, training first responder. It was based on research and books and studies and things like that, but it was not quite steeped in instructional design principles. And so they were asking for volunteers to learn about adult learning. And I'm 20 something years old, first job out of college, still really don't know what I want to do with my life. I'm like, I'll do that. I'll learn about it. And so I did. And the rest is history. I have worked in government, for-profit higher education, and nonprofit ever since, and created training all along the way.
I love it. I love it. I can relate to going to college and having no idea what I want to do. I got my degree in international relations and diplomacy, Heather, which I don't, I mean, I guess I use some of it, like negotiation components, right? I'm curious, actually, as kind of just a random thought, I'm curious, do you think we should be changing this way in which we approach our education system? Like you're in learning development, right? So like, I'm curious, do you think that how we go about this is needs some fixing as to how people decide on their majors when they're only, 17, 18 years old?
Yeah, it's interesting and probably a whole other conversation, like you're saying. I do think there are always ways to improve. I think that a lot of education is very still lecture based and not necessarily pointed towards the career that you're going to have. But that said, I learned a lot in English classes. I took a ton of literature classes, a ton of just grammar classes and things like that. And just it taught me skills that I took with me, right? So critical thinking, being able to analyze something, synthesize information, like those are skills that I took with me, even though I'm not necessarily using my English degree. I think the biggest change I would advocate for, because I don't know higher ed quite as well, but the biggest change I would advocate for is that learning doesn't stop when your degree stops, right? So for those who go to higher education, they go to some 4-year school or whatever, maybe they get an advanced degree and then they're done. I think that is a mistake to think that you're done, right? Because we're never really done learning and growing, and our interests change, our careers change, and to rely solely on 4 years when you were 18 to 21, 22, right? That doesn't necessarily make sense from a long-term perspective.
I think, Heather, what you're saying applies to us as individuals as well as leaders at organizations, whether they're for profit or nonprofit, that they themselves also need to be an advocate for learning. And I'm curious, what do you see these groups or these leaders are getting wrong about learning? I mean, I think that there's a side where people say, yes, it's important, and they go about it the wrong way, and then others even deprioritize it entirely. So just give me your thoughts like about what's kind of broken with how groups leaders are approaching learning right now.
Yeah. I think we receive a lot of mixed messages about learning. I think on the one hand, we see leaders who treat it as check the box. Like it's one of those things that we have to do. We have to provide it. So we'll do it and move on. And there's not a lot of value placed on it until there's a problem. And then it's like, oh, we need training. And then all of a sudden, training is supposed to carry the burden of the problem. And I don't think that either of those is necessarily the right approach to learning. Learning can help solve problems, right? If there's a pain point, if there's a performance issue, that can be part of the solution, but it's usually much more than just sending someone through a training class. And so I think if we actually take a step back and look at learning as this is a strategic lever in your organization, it can help you move towards organizational change. It can help you achieve your organizational strategies. It can also develop the people that just for the people's sake, so to speak, right? So not just for your organizational strategy, but it can develop the people so that you have the people that you need to be able to do those things. And so I think we don't always see leaders who think about learning as a strategy within their organization, but it really is.
Yeah, I can relate to that experience of learning being something that's perceived as a way to solve problems.
Yeah.
When I worked at Tesla years ago and I was in L&D, that was the way it was often approached. It was, oh, we're seeing a metric not being hit, so we create a training to fill that gap. Hurry up, create the training, deliver the training. That should solve all the problems. And the cycle just continued on and on and on. And that's ultimately what you're saying so often is the case.
Yep. It's one side or the other, right? It's just like, oh, something we got to do. Just check the box, get it done. Or, oh my gosh, we have a problem. Like training's going to solve it. Training is the solution. And I just think it's both of those are not their correct approach because it's actually a whole strategy for your organization.
Yeah, I'm curious to learn of a time where you saw it work really well. Let's say you were a learner, you were actually going through a training and you were like, that's how it's done. Take me back to one of those experiences you had.
Okay, I got to think about this. I often say I'm not a very good quote unquote learner, which makes me a better designer because I can be a little bit critical. I think everybody in L&D can be a little bit critical when we're sitting through someone else's training, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think that the experiences that have been most impactful do a few different things. One, they pull me in. So it's not just a training. It is a full experience. There are, let's imagine an in-person training. I can think of a few that were like this, where everything has been thought of in that environment. So when you enter the environment, you are entering an experience. So that is one piece of it. I think another piece is that the trainings that I have again found most impactful have really focused on skills and practice. So there were opportunities, it wasn't just to sit and get, right? There were opportunities for me to practice the thing that I was learning, to get feedback on the thing that I was learning. It's another big piece of it. So I think thinking through the experience, thinking through the skills, practice, and feedback are both really big components for creating something that people, I hate to say enjoy because it's not even necessarily enjoy, right? Sometimes it's not fun to practice and get feedback, but they're the most impactful experiences.
Yeah, I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly fun. It depends on the content, right? It
Yeah.
depends on what they're learning. It needs to be memorable.
Yeah.
It needs to be memorable. And what are I'm curious with experience, right? Because there's so many little things. And I'm really speaking to leaders who are listening who recognize that they want to be better at helping their people to learn new behaviors, upskill, and maybe they have the capacity to do so. They can create that kind of experience.
Yeah.
What are some examples, Heather, of how someone can create that experience where you feel like you're really part of something versus you're just going through a typical, normal, basic training?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a number of different things that help create that environment. I think one, the environment itself, which I know we don't always like to think about in learning and development because we're like, no, we have to focus on the skills or whatever. But like when you walk in the room, is it set up for conversation? Is it set up for practice? Is it, rows of chairs? Is it tables? Is it small groups? How is the environment welcoming people into the space? I think the more like little, like, I don't even know I don't even know what the word is, but just the little touches that you can provide, right? If each group can kind of become a little family group, if you have little name tags, name tag is not the right word there, but if you have like little just touches throughout the space, that helps bring people into the space. I'm also big on providing areas for people to relax, like kind of calm areas where if their brain is working really hard and they just need a minute, right? There's a space that they can go to and they can take that minute. And so that might look like comfortable chairs versus regular seating. It might look like a yoga mat on the floor where they can stretch, right? Some in the space where they feel like, okay, if I need a break, I need a minute, I have a place that I can retreat to. And then I also think from a learning perspective, the more tactile things that we can provide within the environment, the better also. So if there's, chart paper around the room that people are able to use, if there are sticky notes on the table that people are able to use, and it's built into the experience that they'll be able to do those things. You get people up and out of their seats and they're moving around if they're able, right? Like there are things you can do to create that experience that do support the learning, but they just create a different environment for people in the space.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I was also thinking of is something simple like music.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe how impactful it was when I was part of training with this was a company named Solar City, and then we were acquired by Tesla. And me walking into a room where music was playing, the facilitators were giving people high fives when they walked in,
Yeah.
and it's detail like that that at least started the experience, and I felt welcomed. And then from there, all those other little details that you mentioned. Yeah, I was thinking about how small tables, having them even come up with a team name if it makes sense for a certain activity, and now they're like discussing the team name they want to have, and now they feel like actually I was talking about this. I met with a group March, yeah, and we did a workshop, and I saw some of them just this past month, and they remembered their team names.
Nice.
They were talking about the team
Yeah.
names, you know?
It sticks with you. It makes you feel like you're part of it. And when you think about learning is uncomfortable because it's something you're probably not already good at. You're doing it in front of other people in many cases. And so that can be uncomfortable. You're being asked to change the way you do something. That's uncomfortable. And so the more of those touches that you can add where people feel like they're part of the experience, it's not being done to them, it's being done with them, the more successful you're going to be.
Yeah, I agree. And then you were talking about skills, practice, feedback. You hear it all the time, I'm sure. I used to hear it all the time. I still do, which is, oh, well, I hate role play. I don't want to role, like, oh, no, like, don't make us do that. And I know there's just so much research behind the value of you doing the thing. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on role playing activities?
Yeah, I don't think everything deserves a role play, but I do think there's a time and a place for that. I think the biggest thing with any kind of like scenario role play practice, it has to be as close to reality as possible. I think sometimes we create role plays because they sound good in theory, and then we put people in kind of the fishbowl experience where they're role playing and everyone else is watching, and it's not even necessarily a scenario that they would face on the job. Like, it might relate to the skill, but it's not necessarily something that feels realistic to them. And that is even harder to navigate as an individual, a learner, and having everyone watch you. I think role plays are fine. I'm not anti role plays. I'm not pro role plays. I think it just depends on the what you're trying to accomplish. But whatever that skill is, they need to be able to practice it. And
Yeah.
so role play is one way that you could potentially have them practice things, right? If they're practicing how to enter data into a spreadsheet, you don't need a role play for that, right? Like, just have them do it. And it's probably a really poor example comparison wise, but like some things are beneficial to role play. If you're coaching, you probably need to role play. It doesn't have to be in front of the whole room, but you probably need people to practice those coaching skills, which means they're going to have to kind of role play a little bit. So it just depends on what the skill is, but make it realistic, as close to their real life as possible, and think about kind of how you're creating that, how you're setting that up, and if that's going to be the more comfortable way for them to practice.
I agree. I think anything that's, I hate the term soft skill, but you know what I mean by that, which is anything that requires some communication, coaching, giving someone feedback, a sales conversation, overcoming objections. You can't just write down notes from a slide and expect that you're going to improve on that skill. You have to do it over and over and over again. What are your thoughts on competition and gamification? I mean, it's such a big part of what you see now in the L&D world. What are your thoughts on that approach?
I think it kind of depends on the situation, what you're trying to do. I think gamification became a really trendy word maybe 15 years ago, and 15, I don't know. And it became the thing that everybody wanted, all of the stakeholders, right? Like, let's just gamify it. and I there's some value in making it a little bit competitive, but I don't think it's always the right solution, right? And so it's really thinking through, who is your audience? What are you wanting them to do? Does it make sense to gamify it? and how can you do it in a way that's as close to real life as possible?
And if it aligns with your two principles, right? Does it, one, enhance the experience and improve their skills, their practice, and do they get the feedback? I think that what could happen is the gamification competition, it could improve the experience, but you don't actually practice anything. You're just adding this
Right.
layer of competition.
Right.
And it could, yeah, it could just not be necessary to the learning itself. And there's also the take now. Okay, well, there's everyone has these short attention spans. Heather, how does anyone learn anything when they have TikTok and they are just mindlessly scrolling and we can't keep their attention? What are your thoughts on that?
Do we have short attention spans though? Do we?
I
Because
think so.
you can watch Netflix for Netflix to ask you if you're still watching, right?
There's an interesting thing about Netflix. I just read about how Netflix has asked certain um, those who create the movies to have to or mention the plot again throughout the movie because people are getting distracted checking their phones and they're not fully engaged in the movie.
Yeah.
So it's not because, by the way, so my thoughts on this is not that we've all of a sudden had this attention problem that wasn't there. The human mind is naturally just prone to distraction. It's just the way we're wired. If something is so engaging and captivating, it will keep our attention.
Yeah.
I just think it takes intentionality for that to happen.
Yeah. I would agree. We have a lot of distractions. And those distractions are much easier for us to access now than maybe ever before. So I would agree with that. I do think, though, that when we are interested in something, we will give it our attention. I think we see that people who are into gaming, right, like that, they'll do that for hours without doing anything else, right? So I think if it's something that you are interested in, you'll do it.
Yeah. So then the approach would be, don't attempt to create a learning and development strategy assuming it's just like we have to come up with ways to keep it short and simple, and that way it will just align with a distracted society. You're saying no, rather just make it so good and interesting and captivating that it will capture their attention.
Potentially, yeah. I think there's a time and a place for those short and sweet learning opportunities, right? Sometimes it's nice to have just a little thing and you move on with your life, right? That's what podcasts are. We drop a 20-minute, 60-minute podcast and people consume it and move on with their life. I think there are opportunities for things like that, but I don't think everything has to be that way. So to move totally into this kind of short, bite-sized, micro-learning type of environment is not the right answer. I think it's thinking through who the audience is, what the context is, what the content is, how complex the learning is going to be, and then figuring out what's going to be the best solution for that. But I think assuming that people will not sit is also a mistake.
Right. Exactly. I agree with you. I think if it's done well, people will stay. I did a talk recently where there was a time limit and they started me late. And I was like, okay, I had an hour talk, Heather, and I had to somehow bring it down to like 40 minutes,
Yeah.
And so
No
what's that?
No pressure.
No pressure, right? Oh, it's always like the most fun when I look back at like, how did I figure that out? And I've done what I do for a while. So I did figure it out. And it was a really nice compliment. Someone said to me, I said, it was the organizer. I said to her afterwards, I said, I was just trying to get done at 1:25 because I knew that was the time. She said, Jay, it was so good. You could have went on for another 15, 20 minutes and you wouldn't have lost a single person.
Awesome.
And that was really awesome feedback. And it aligns with what you're saying, right? Which is like, no, people will stay with you if it's that good.
Yeah, they will.
Yeah, and they're getting something out of it. And I think I'm curious your process, because Lucy's stuck in this kind of cycle of solving these problems. People reach out to her and just say, hey, fix this, create a PDF for that. Oh my God, I remember these requests. Create a PDF for this, Like, okay, you were just saying like, know your audience and kind of like create the strategy. If Lucy or anyone who is looking to take a step back and create that strategy and not be so reactive, what are some of the steps that you encourage leaders to take?
Yeah. I think, well, first, I'm going to I'm going to talk you through a few things if that's okay. But I would also say that taking a more of a coaching approach, if I were actually sitting down with Lucy, might be the better way to get to a better solution. But I do think there are some core things that we can talk through to help Lucy. The first one is I always start with this. It's mindset and identity. And I know sometimes people are like, I don't know if that's really what it is. But when we approach our work like we are a learning designer, we design learning, right? As a natural instinct. If somebody asks for training, we say yes, because we're a learning designer. That's what we do. But I actually think we're not learning designers, we're change agents. And so when you view yourself as a change agent, you're forced to pause, you're forced to ask better questions. You become an advocate for what real change actually requires, which may or may not be training or a PDF or whatever this request is, right? So learning may be the vehicle that we primarily use to create change, but the change itself is the ultimate goal, not the training. And so I think the first step really is kind of within ourselves. How do we view ourselves? Because that impacts how we show up with other people. Go ahead. I see you.
I was going to say, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's fascinating. It's like, what hat are you wearing? You know, like that's what I thought of as you were describing that. And I often think of it like in a similar vein where sometimes I'll speak with a salesperson and they're like wearing this salesperson hat all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage them to kind of take that off and put on more of the hat of a coach, right? And it's a different feel. It's a different energy when you see yourself as a coach, or even use the term, advisor, than you would as a salesperson. Because a salesperson, it sounds like it's this transactional thing where you're just trying to get something. And your shift from learning designer to change agent has a similar feel to me, which is like, okay, now I'm stepping a bit more into curiosity than I am just implementing some learning design to get a certain result.
Yep. And in my experience, almost every request for training is either being driven by a change that's happening in the organization, or it's being used to drive a change that they want to see in the organization. And so if we can put on that change agent hat and we can hunt for the change, we'll be much more likely to be successful, because we'll be able to create the right solution that will drive that change, which makes the stakeholder happy. And so I think, yes, maybe it comes in as a request for a PDF or a last minute workshop, or, whatever that might look like. But what's the change? Let's put on our change agent hat, not our learning design hat. Let's find the change and then figure out how do we help create that change. So you go ahead.
I was going to say, when you're looking at that from the perspective of a change agent, there are a few questions that I would assume you would encourage Lucy to be asking. What would you encourage her to be asking someone else, or let's say the stakeholder, in this case, the leader, to be able to identify what change is required or being asked?
Yeah, I think good. There are lots of good questions. I can give you a few examples of things that I have used. I think your chances of being successful with asking questions kind of relies on your ability to build relationships and influence others. And so every conversation that you have is an opportunity to ask questions, to build that relationship, to help people see you the way you see yourself, which is now as a change agent. And so some of the questions that might come up are, I see this request for a PDF. What problem are we trying to solve? What behavior needs to change? Why is this thing happening or not happening? What are the barriers that are preventing people from doing this? Why would someone do this? What would motivate them to do it? What does success look like? What is your vision when you think about success? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? How does this connect to strategy? Because maybe there's an organizational change that's happening, and this is really connected to that organizational change. So I think there are questions that we can ask that help uncover what the actual need is and what the actual change is.
Yeah, those are great questions. A version of your question that I found myself asking a lot, and I still ask it every now and then, depending on the situation, is what does good look like?
Yeah.
What does good look like? Like, walk me through that. And here's what's fascinating about this, Heather, and I'm sure you've seen this too. If you're really good at this, what you're going to find is that sometimes the solution is not training,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes
That's
the
okay.
solution is completely different, and that's okay.
Yep. Yep. Another question similar to what you just asked, if it's 6 months from now, what changed? Like if we're successful and it's 6 months down the road, what actually changed? Because it wasn't just the PDF probably that created the change. So what changed? Describe that picture to me. And that definitely helps get you on the right track. I
Yeah.
think though there's still this piece where somebody you could ask that question and they could say, "Oh, well, people are whatever. Their managers are coaching their staff, and that's what it looks like. That's what success is. They're coaching their staff. Great. A PDF is not necessarily going to get them there, right?
Right.
You've uncovered that you need something else, but then there's still this piece, again, going back to kind of this relationship piece, making sure you have the relationship to be able to do this, to ask questions, to propose new solutions. There's still this piece where you need to build a case for what's really needed. And if you have on a learning design hat, it's harder to build that case. And so when we ask good questions, we're collecting information. We can then use their words, their desired outcomes, and talk about what they want and build the case for what they need. And it's not about what we do, what we offer. It's not about training. It's not about a PDF. It's about how what we do can give them what they want. Right.
Yeah.
And so if we can frame that conversation around them, around their needs, around their desires, then we're much more likely to be successful when we say, hey, a PDF isn't going to do that.
Yeah, I love this. And I like that you're referring it as building a case. I know that you've either as a consultant or you yourself have had the experience where there was resistance because, oh, but we don't have the resources, we don't have the time, right? You hear all those objections, Heather. And I'm curious, has there been a time that you could tell me a story of when you had to propose something and it was met with resistance and you overcame it?
It is, I feel like that is every day in our lives as learning development. Um, I think, oh, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of a specific example. I think I was working with an organization. It was a global nonprofit, and we were working on an e-learning actually for this particular skill. And it was kind of an introductory e-learning to kind of get them on the road towards this particular skill. And my vision, this is within the solution, not the solution itself. My vision was that we start with a story that everyone could relate to, and then move people from this story to what they needed to do. And so the idea was that the story was their opportunity to connect with the content and to understand why this was needed, right? So it was almost
Mm.
like a buy-in, a connection and a buy-in piece that is much harder to accomplish in a self-paced e-learning than it is in a virtual or in-person environment where people come together, right? The synchronous environment. And so that was my vision. But to do this, I needed to actually play into a scenario that the organization was trying to move away from
Mm.
and use that to say, and this is why we need to make this change, make this transition. And there was some resistance with using a scenario that they were trying to move away from. And so it required just, again, a strong relationship. I had built over time trust, and it required conversations where we talked about what the options were, why this was included, if we didn't include it, what the risks were, what we could do instead if they did not want to go that route, but what the risks would be if we removed the scenario, right? And so I think it's just conversation and not assuming I didn't go into that conversation assuming I know everything, right? Because they hold the context for the organization, they hold the subject matter expertise. And so here's why I'm thinking this is the right thing. But let's talk about what this could look like because maybe I'm missing something. And I think when we approach it as not a debate we need to win, but as a conversation, we're much more likely actually to walk away satisfied with the result of that.
Yeah. There's a few times now you've mentioned the importance of the relationship. And I was thinking about how I worked with someone at Tesla. His name was Tom, and he was the best I've ever seen at just building relationships, Heather. He was just so natural at it. Everyone wanted him in the room. Everyone liked him. Everyone trusted him. And because of that, he wouldn't be met with as much resistance as other people, just in general. And so I guess one of the lessons I'm hearing is for Lucy or anyone else who's in a position where they're trying to advocate for more learning, it's important to be intentional and proactive about cultivating relationships, even if you're not asking for something, it's just for the sake of a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Trust, credibility, the relationship itself, your personal brand walks ahead of you into that space. So even if you're walking into a room with people or virtual room with people that you've never met, your brand precedes you. And so how do people perceive you? And is it aligned with how you want to be perceived? I think all of these things are part of that relationship building process and make it easier for you to work together, to collaborate, right? And so, yeah, to me, that's one of the top skills for learning and development is building relationships. You can learn instructional design principles. You can learn, I mean, I did, right? You can learn adult learning theory, but you need to be able to build relationships and think critically and be curious.
Yeah. And then you have stakeholders, leaders who are rooting for you. They're supporting you. They're on your side. Like you were saying, it's not a me versus you anymore. It's let's figure this out shoulder to shoulder. And then you talked just now about, in that story, about story. You talked about the power of story and how you wanted the e-learning to begin with a story.
Yeah.
How important do you think stories are to learning and development in general?
I think stories are incredibly important. I think if you look back, years and years, hundreds of years, story has always been at the forefront of how we learn. I think the important thing is that whatever we create, in person, virtual, live virtual, self-paced, PDF, video, whatever it is, that we're designing for impact, right? The goal, again, isn't training. The goal is change. And so we have to design for change. And if you look at behavior change experts like James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, BJ Fogg, author of Tiny Habits, if you look at what the behavior change experts are saying and you apply that to learning, you're actually going to have a much higher success rate of seeing change on the other side. And some of the things that they say is if you want to change a behavior, you need some sort of prompt, some sort of cue, something that says to you, oh, I need to change. And so for me, in the example that I gave you, that story was part of that cue, right? It was that prompt. It was like, oh, I need to make this change. You also need, if you look at behavior change experts, a cue, you need craving. You need to want the change. There needs to be a desire, a motivation to make the change happen because change is hard. And it might sound good when you're sitting through a training and then you get back to your desk. It's going to be the first thing that falls away because it's uncomfortable to actually change. And there's a good chance your systems, your environment, the things around you are not set out to help you change. And so you have to want it. You're going to meet resistance. You're going to meet friction. So you have to want that change. So the more we can help people want the change, the more we can help them kind of discover their motivation for the change, the better. And then change also requires a new routine. So what does it actually look like in action? I think this is where learning development actually thrives because we can teach the skill, we can contextualize it, we can make it seem really close to reality, And so then that becomes an action that they can repeat outside of the learning experience. And then the other thing we know about change is there's a reward. There has to be some sort of like meaningful payoff that reinforces that habit in order for them to sustain that change. And so if we're designing and we're looking at, okay, what is the cue? What's going to prompt them to do this? What would make them want to do it? What would motivate them? What does it look like in action? How can we create the skill and that routine for them? And then what is the reward? Like in long term, why should they continue to do this? Maybe it's that maybe it's something intrinsic, right? They feel like they're contributing. I work with nonprofits, so there is kind of a little bit of that intrinsic, like connect to mission, connect to purpose. So maybe there's an intrinsic reward, but maybe there's not. Maybe you need to think about how you're going to include the supervisor in the overall experience. And they're not attending whatever the learning solution is, but they need to be a part of the experience because they need to be able to recognize their staff changing behavior. So really kind of thinking through the whole behavior change process as we design. So to me, it goes beyond story, but story is a great tool in the behavior change process.
The story can do a number of things because the story can be where the craving comes from. Like if you hear a great story and it inspires, it gives you a sense of, oh, I can do that too. Like that can be me. Then the story did its job. It created the craving.
Yeah.
And it could kind of serve both, right? It could be a cue and what leads to the craving. I mean, I'm thinking about how I listen to audiobooks, Heather. Like I'm not much of a reader. And then there's a book I really wanted to read, but I struggled to just get a book out and read it. I like to listen, And so I had to create the exact kind of system that you just designed. I did it for myself, right? Like I made a little like routine. I lit a candle. I would light the candle. That was my cue, right? I would then begin to read, and then I'd reward myself afterwards by being able to enjoy something as a reward for having read, And these systems work and they're effective. So like, okay, when you think about, let's say, a behavior change that you would see in a nonprofit, what's an example of that cycle? Like, how have you used those 4 steps in a way that did create some behavior change in the past?
Yeah. So I think a traditional approach would be, let me put together a PowerPoint, let me list out the steps of things they need to do. Maybe we'll throw in some practice, right? That's kind of the traditional approach to training. So let's say you want your nonprofit leader, you want your staff or your volunteers to capture key information about the people they serve, right? Some, I don't know if they're entering your space or they're calling or whatever, but there's some data that needs to be captured. So I think the first question would be, well, when exactly would they collect that information? Because we need to know if there is a prompt that exists that we can design around, or if we need to create a prompt. So do they collect the information when the client calls? Do they collect it when they check in for a service? Do they collect information after some service ends, right? So thinking through, does the prompt exist or does it need to be created? That's kind of the first piece there. And then thinking about why would they want to collect that information is kind of tapping into motivation. Why would they want to perform that? Will it make their jobs easier? Will it help them avoid burnout because you can better staff the facility because now you know who's coming in when? Will it help you show your impact to funders, which in turn will help keep their jobs secure, right? Because funding is a necessary part of the process. So thinking through what could potentially help motivate them to do the thing that you need them to do. And I think that's not just from an organization perspective, right? An organization perspective might say, well, we need to show impact to funders. Well, that's great for the organization, but what does that mean for me? Well, for you, it means that there's more job security. We can better staff because we have more funding. We have better equipment, right? Whatever it is that would actually come from that funding that gives them personal meaning. And then from a routine perspective, again, I think this is where learning and development tends to thrive, but how can we make it easy to perform the behavior? What's the smallest, clearest, easiest version of that? And start there, because you can always add to it later. But how can you make it like easy to implement? So, for example, you need to collect this information. Is that a 3-question intake form? And if so, can they memorize it? Or does it need to exist somewhere? Is it a checklist on their desk? Is it something on their computer digitally that they're accessing through the internet, right? Like, what does it look like and how do we help them do it? Not just the skill, but the whole thing has to be easy, right? And then how can we deliver a meaningful reward? So how can they feel that payoff quickly as they're making that change? To your point, when you're done reading, you go get something that makes you feel good about the fact that you read, right? So is it some sort of immediate thanks or immediate recognition from their supervisor? Is it a lighter workload because now you've staffed appropriately, like you said it would help you do, right? So what is the payoff and how can they feel that or receive that pretty much immediately as they're making that change happen? Because that's how you'll actually start to see that change be sustained. So, I mean, that's kind of a simplistic example of like, oh, we need people to collect data or collect information or whatever. But like, whatever the change is, how can we make it really, really simple and then tap into those behavior change principles?
I'm so glad I asked, because that was a fantastic example. And I kind of got to see inside your mind, Heather, of how you put it together, right? Because that's not what, naturally, it's not what someone would think, right? They'd be like, well, just this is what they have to go through. Like you said, PowerPoint slides, and then we do that. But you had a much more thoughtful approach there, which considers human behavior and what are the psychological levers that get people to actually change behavior in a way that's not at all manipulative or anything like that. It's just effective. It's what works, and people will be bought in. And Heather, and also, by the way, I love the reduce the friction component, right? Make it easy.
Yeah.
Right. We so often don't think about that. We think, well, all we're going to ask them to do is do these 4 steps. It's like, well, can't you do that in one? Can you find a way to do it in 1 step instead of 4? It makes all the difference in the world to see change when you make it simple and easy. And so I'd love for you to imagine, Heather, if you were to meet Lucy in this story, let's say she's listening to your podcast and she is really resonating with your message, and she reaches out to you and she says, all right, here's what I'm going through, Heather. And you listen and you have an opportunity to ask her a question or two to get her to start to approach things differently. What would you ask Lucy and why?
Yeah, I would actually use some of the same questions that I used at the beginning.
Yeah.
But I think, what does success look like to you? This is a challenge for you now. What does it look like when it's not challenging anymore? What is your vision? If things changed and things felt seamless at work for you in 6 months, what does that mean? What does that look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And really getting an understanding of what exactly those pain points are. Because maybe if I had just answered the original question, right, and I start talking about behavior change principles, and she's like, no, I already do that. That's not helpful, right? And
right.
So what does it look like? Maybe it's the relationship piece that she's struggling with. Maybe it's explaining how what she does meets other people's needs. And so if I can understand what those pain points are, what the challenges are, and where she wants to be, right, then we have a gap. And that gap is where we can work together and close it so that she can reach that place of success that she has in mind.
I love it. I love it. And for all our listeners to learn more about the great work Heather is doing, please check her out on LinkedIn. You're quite active there. You told me, Heather, and I think that may be how we connected. And so it's Heather Burright, BURRIGHT, as well as the podcast Learning for Good. Can be found on any podcast platform of your choosing. Heather, thank you so much for your time today. This was amazing.
Thank you, Jay.
This conversation with Heather brought me back to my days in learning and development. And I have to say, even if you're not someone who's in learning and development, you're a person of influence, you're a leader, and how you help others to change behavior is important. It's a skill, and Heather, I think, broke it down so well in this conversation. I'm going to do my best to give you what I believe are the three of the most important takeaways. The first one is that training your team won't fix a people problem. The instinct so many have is that people need more training. But the real question is, what is the behavior that you're actually looking at that needs to be changed? And then why isn't it changing? It could actually be more of a motivation issue, or environmental, or if it's a systems issue. Before you build anything, really ask, what does success look like? What does good look like? And then determine, hey, is training actually a part of it? Second takeaway, if you want real change, make the new behavior easy. We talked about that habit cycle. There's the cue, the desire, the behavior, and the reward in those exact steps. If you make the behavior one that's really difficult or very complex, you're not going to see behavior change. It needs to be as frictionless as possible. I've coached hundreds of leaders. I know this is true. I've trained thousands more. This is absolutely the truth. If you make it easy, if you make it simple, you'll see the behavior change. If you make it too difficult, you're going to struggle. Third takeaway, your relationships determine your influence. If you really want to challenge the status quo, if you want to propose new ideas, if you want to get people to buy in, then you need to have trust in that conversation. They need to look at you as someone who's credible. And if that isn't there, it doesn't matter how great your idea is. People resist change. So if you are able to showcase that this change is going to lead towards a shared goal, sure, they'll be interested, but you have to earn that trust first before you can even share the idea. Join us on Friday, because that's what I'm going to dive deeper into. That one word, trust. Because I do believe there are people who get seats at the table because of how they're showing up, and other people who don't get seats at the table because of how they're showing up. And we really need to be able to flex that muscle of influence so that others see us as credible. Really, always it's trust. You will hire someone that you trust. You will listen to someone that you trust. You will have that person at the table with you because you trust them. So we're going to talk through how you can be more effective at building trust within your organization or your team on Friday's episode. So don't miss that. And until next time, thank you so much for listening. I am rooting for you.